Hi, welcome back to another Read with Me, Race to the Truth in the African American Story. So, we're going to continue with chapter 1 and we're going to plug at it bit by bit, piece by piece. Um, and I just want to thank you so much for learning with me and sharing this time with me. I hope that you're learning something new, and I can't wait to continue learning and reading together. So, let's continue. The seafaring blackjacks. Have you ever heard of the seafaring blackjacks? You probably haven't. That's because, like much of American history, stories about maritime culture and seafaring adventure center on white men's experiences, omitting the colossal contributions of black mariners who harnessed their knowledge of oceans and seas for occupation, adventure, and bounty. I've never heard of them myself. I don't know if you have, but I sure haven't. So, learning something new already. Black men from Africa and parts of Europe were traveling by sea throughout the world during the 16th century and participated in some of the most significant New World explorations. Others served in support roles, using their linguistic skills in early slave trading convoys that left the coast of Africa. Some African and African American men were even pirates or buccaneers during the late 17th century. Personally, I would watch that movie. I don't give a poop about Pirates of the Caribbean, but I would watch a movie about this. I think that would be super, super cool to see. Later, black men in the American colonies occupied service roles such as cooks, stewards, drummers, and fifers aboard ships. By the time of the American Revolution, they were thriving as valuable seamen. But seafaring was a dangerous way for a black man to earn a living during slavery. Free blackjacks traveling from north to southern states, where slavery was a booming industry, constantly faced threats of jail, kidnapping, and enslavement. Sadly, thousands of seafaring black men who worked as navigators and as crew members aboard trade ships were sometimes captured and sent into slavery. Yet others were able to make a living as skilled businessmen, like Juan Garrido. He even amassed wealth and influence as a result of his nautical expeditions. 16th century Black conquistadors. Mm. In 1513, Garrido accompanied Ponce de Leon to Florida, but they were no match for the native people they encountered. They left defeated, and it would be over a decade before Garrido would travel with Ponce de Leon again. But in the meantime, he kept very busy as a skilled conquistador. In 1519, Handsome John helped the Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez invade the Aztec Empire and claim the area that is now Mexico for Spain. But the Aztec people were a greater military match than Cortez and his men imagined. By the time the conquest was over, a great many Spaniards and native people had been killed. However, Garrido survived, and as a reward for his valor, he was given land and property near the capital city, where he settled down, married, had 3 children, and became a farmer. Garrido returned to Florida in 1521 alongside Ponce de Leon on what would be the Spanish explorer's last expedition. Armed with weapons, supplies, and men to subdue the indigenous people they encountered, Ponce de Leon and his fellow conquistadors were no match for the Native Americans they tried to conquer. Ponce de Leon lost his life as a result of an arrow wound during the failed conquest. But once again, Garrido escaped death while fighting for European expansion into North America. During his lifetime, Handsome John traveled throughout the world as a free black man who helped the Spaniards invade, pillage, and capture the people they encountered, just as they would go on to do in his native land on the west coast of Africa. By traveling to the New World, distant lands occupied by diverse indigenous people, alongside European traders and conquistadors who would stake their claim throughout North and South America and the Caribbean, Gardito and others like him helped fuel European expansion and the subsequent widespread theft of natural resources and people from Africa that followed. Ultimately, the explorers didn't discover a new world. In reality, they only encountered places and people that were unknown or new to them. In the next century, European colonies would not only survive but begin to thrive off slave labor during what would become the largest and most lucrative market for mass enslavement of people in the world history. African people from diverse backgrounds were targeted, captured, and enslaved by European slave traders. During the 1400s, European nations set their sights on the natural resources, spices, minerals, and precious metals found on the continent of Africa and Asia. Seafaring Portuguese explorers and traders first arrived on the west coast of Africa in the 15th century. They wanted to access Africa's rich natural sources, such as plentiful gold flowing from the west coast mines in what is now Ghana. Gold was so abundant in Ghana that the Portuguese gave the coastal African region the name Mina to refer to the bountiful gold mines they encountered there. In 1821, it became a British colony named the Gold Coast, and the name stuck until Ghana renamed itself upon independence in 1957. The continent of Africa was appealing to European empires that wanted to amass greater wealth, power, and exclusive trade routes and arrangements with Asia. Once they arrived in Africa, they encountered people of different ethnic, religious, and linguistic backgrounds. Just as most early European travelers had never seen Black people before they landed upon the shores of Africa, most of the free Africans they met upon arrival had never encountered white men. By the 15th century, Europeans realized that they had struck it rich in Africa. Seeing the vast resources, they began trading with African leaders. Over time, however, Europeans realized the value of Africa's most precious resource, its people. At first, the enterprise of chattel slavery was mutually beneficial for both Europeans and African tribal leaders. Europeans traded items such as cloth, metals, guns, and ammunition for captive Africans who were prisoners of war or who had been kidnapped by other Africans precisely for the purpose of trade with Europeans. The Portuguese prince, Henry the Navigator, sent explorers to the west coast of Africa in search of natural riches and access to the region's robust spice trade routes. But by the mid 15th century, Portugal's emissaries returned with gold dust and 10 captured Africans, who would be the first of millions to be captured, enslaved, and trafficked for 4 centuries to come. In 1444, the Portuguese captured 240 African men, women, and children from the Arguin Island, located near Mauritania. Upon their return to Portugal, they forced their captives to walk naked along the bustling Lisbon trading docks, where curious onlookers witnessed what would be the first of many shipments of human cargo. A decade later, the Portuguese were shipping upwards of 800 enslaved people per year from the island. Portugal led the way in establishing an advanced system of trading humans on an international scale. And the beginning of the slavery enterprise, Portugal relied exclusively on African leaders and traders for their captives. But when their demand for enslaved people to cultivate plantations along the coast of Africa in the Caribbean and in Brazil increased, they mounted direct attacks on coastal African peoples in hopes of enslaving larger numbers on their own. Early on, the Portuguese were no match for the African people they encountered, whose knowledge of the maritime skills, the coastal terrain, and the unique military tactics gave them a defensive advantage. One such scrimmage took place in 1444 when Portugal attacked the Wolof Empire in what is now Senegal to kidnap and enslave its people for their growing labor needs. But the Portuguese, underestimating Senegal's tactical skills and military might, failed in their attack. Realizing that their only means of acquiring African slave labor was through their existing relationship with local African leaders and traders, they reestablished those arrangements to guarantee the continuous supply of slaves. But over time, they changed their tactics for acquiring Africans for slave labor once again. Eventually, the Portuguese returned with better armor and weapons, which enabled them to subdue the West and Central African peoples who had been supplying them with captives. Now, the Portuguese were able to find and seize their own slaves, giving them a monopoly in the slave trade for years to come. Whew. We can go ahead and sit with that for a second before we continue. Portugal set its sights on the peoples of West Africa. The agrarian or farming lifestyles of West African people made them the most appealing and valuable slaves. Additionally, there were sedentary farmers, meaning they grew their food in the same nearby location every year, which made them easy to capture when they least suspected it. Their knowledge of farming and sophisticated agriculture in some areas would be essential to the growth and development of the colonies and then the United States for years to come. As Europeans developed more advanced weapons, such as cannons and pistols, they set their sights on nomadic African ethnic groups that moved from place to place in search of food. As mentioned earlier, some African chiefs and other tribal leaders would trade captured enemies to European slave traders. These insiders used their knowledge of the regional geography and local villages to ensnare unwitting African men, women, and children for the purpose of supplying Europeans with a steady stream of captives. Why would Africans help European slavers and African chiefs kidnap people from other African tribal groups? Well, for starters, they saw slave trading as a strategy to amass wealth and, more important, to wield greater power over rival tribal groups. In Africa, many prisoners of war from other regional ethnic groups lived among their captors, working, starting families, and even building homes in some instances, unless the war infractions struck a peace deal or formed a mutually beneficial alliance. Over time, some of these captives could earn their freedom. Some married members within the ruling kingdom and became members of a new tribe of new tribal groups and eventually established new lives far away from those they once knew. But how rival African tribes treated their captured enemies and how European slave traders treated the people they captured and took far away from their homeland were as different as night and day. Stolen from home, then hidden in plain sight. Africans who were captured and then sold to Europeans found themselves shackled together with strangers, bound for a strange land. Their journey as captives was brutal and inhumane from the very start. They were forced to walk hundreds of miles from the interior to the West African coast in a coffle, a line of enslaved people chained or tied together, not knowing where they were headed or when or if they would ever see their families again. By the time they arrived at the coast, they were starving, dehydrated, and exhausted from a horrific trek that had taken them so far from home, from everything they knew and everyone they loved. As news of the disappearance and capture of local men, women, and children spread, parents and community elders rallied to keep loved ones safe, but they were no match for the slave traffickers. White people devised cruel restraints to subdue and punish captive Africans. Forged out of iron, these shackles, manacles, and ghoulish face masks limited slaves' movement and their ability to turn completely around to see where they had come from, preventing captives from determining where they were being taken on the coast in relation to their villages. Children wore shackles as well. In some cases, a mother would be shackled with her children. Some slave shackles even included basic identifiers of the captives, such as Negro woman or Negro child. The make and style of slave shackles, manacles, and face masks varied in their degree of restraint, but one thing's for sure. They were effective torture devices that made it nearly impossible for captive enslaved people to escape the snares of their white captors. Experiencing this level of inhumanity, many fell into a Great Depression and could not be consoled by the other pitiful strangers they were fated to live with during their collective nightmare. Many tried to resist their iron chains, but to no avail. Their will to be free of their shackles and return to their families was overpowered by the iron restraints. Some did escape, only to be lost in the dense forest so far from home. Other attempts were thwarted, ending in recapture or death at the hands of the captors. A great many died along the way. Once at the coast, they suffered even greater indignities, and they were showcased before strange white men who poked, prodded, and inspected their naked bodies to determine their strength and value as slaves. At West African coastal forts built by the Dutch, such as Cape Coast, Goree Island, Bunsey Island, and Elmina, captured Africans would spend up to 3 months imprisoned in dark, damp dungeons, chained together with people they didn't know, and with little to no sunlight. Ghana's Cape Coast Castle was a chamber of horrors for over 1,500 captive African men, women, and children at the time. Captive men could number 1,000, with women routinely accounting for the remaining 500. Captive Africans were forced to eat, if you can count the meager food they were given, which consisted of grains and palm oil, and relieve themselves in the same place where they slept and spent their days and nights. Those captives who tried to choose starvation rather than eat the unsavory provisions were force fed. The holding areas had very little ventilation, so the captives inhaled the stench of human waste, vomit, and the rotting flesh of those who died alongside them. The slave traffickers didn't even give them the dignity of bathing. They lay trapped in filth, hungry, thirsty, frightened, bewildered, and defenseless against the enemies they didn't know they had. As terrible as all this was, they didn't realize that their nightmare was going to get far worse as time went on. Captured Africans spent their days and nights in the slave castle dungeons and were allowed to come outside in the courtyards for only a few minutes of exercise each day. They suffered other terrors as well when their fellow captors experienced depression, fear, and anguish from their desperate plight, or when the sick among them died and they were trapped in the dark with infected bodies. Some rebelled, but to no avail. The slave castles were fortified inside and out against both enemy attack and attempts to escape from within. Certainly, they longed to break free and make their way back to their villages and families. Surely they hoped that the doors of the dungeons and the castle would be flung open so they could step into the light of a new day and escape their nightmarish conditions, as if awakening from a terrible dream. All right, we're going to go ahead and leave it there today. We've got a little bit more to go in this chapter. And then we'll do some comprehension questions and stuff together that are provided at the end of each chapter of the book. So I just wanted to thank you again for spending this time with me, for learning our collective history together. Bit by bit, we're going to plug through it. Make sure you go eat something, drink some water, take care of yourself, hug a loved one, hug your pet, be kind to someone, and I will see you next time.